Everyone wants the best deal when they buy a business. It's human nature, you want the best deal. But what if I was to tell you that the best deal might actually be costing you money? So I've been a business broker for close to 20 years, and it's a really common theme that runs through the hundreds of businesses that I've sold, and that is the buyer wants the best deal. That's what they're looking for, a great deal. But how can that actually cost you money? Well, it's quite easy, and I'll explain it like this. That way you don't make the same mistake and you don't end up costing yourself money waiting for the best deal. Well, you know how it works. You hold fire buying something because you want the best deal. You don't want to be ripped off and you don't want to buy the wrong thing. Now, it's not necessarily the best business that you're looking for. It's not even necessarily the best price, although that does come into it. But what you want is the best overall package. You want to be sure that what you're buying is exactly the right thing for you. So you're cautious, you check everything, you double check everything. You do your own calculations around price, you do everything you can to make sure you get the best deal. Well, let me give you the example of John. Now, John was a business buyer. He was your typical business buyer. He wanted to buy a business for all the right reasons, and he was looking around trying to find a business that worked for him, but he couldn't quite do that. He'd done all his research, he'd done all his planning, and he knew what he should be paying for businesses, where they should be, how they should look, and what would be right for him. So he kept on looking. He'd look at a business, go through his process, no, didn't fit, wasn't perfect, and he'd move on to the next one, and he'd move on to the next one. And this happened time and time again. But he was determined to buy the right business for him. Okay, so let's have a closer look at John and see what he did right, and in fact what he did wrong, and why it was costing him money, shall we? So I first met John a while ago. He was looking to buy a business. He saw an advert of mine and rang me up and had a look at it. We had a good chat, and according to him, it was the kind of business he was looking for. It was probably the right thing for him. So we went through the whole process. We took him out to see the business. We gave him more information. We gave him more accounting information. We gave him more information. And what John did was he went through his analysis, and unfortunately it was almost paralysis by analysis. He looked far too much into the business, and if it's possible, he thought too much. Yeah, I know. How can you be accused of thinking too much? But you understand what I mean. He went through his process bit by bit and piece by piece. Now he finally came back to me and he said, look, it's a great business, it's probably exactly what I'm looking for, but there are two issues with it. He said the first one I can't change. I think it's a bit too far away from home. So he didn't want to drive the 30 odd minutes from his place to where the business was located. Now I said to him, look, that's fine, the lease is up in 12-18 months, maybe you can move it closer, maybe you can relocate somewhere nearer to where you live. And that was very much possible. The business was simply an import distribution business, so it was operating out of an office, it was using a contract warehouse, so moving that office was not going to be a problem. But the second issue, well, that was more of a problem. Now, simply speaking, Jono did his calculations and he decided that the business was too expensive. So he had his own formula and he worked all this out, and he came to the conclusion that the business was not worth the price we were asking, not worth asking price. And he thought it was worth, well, significantly less. So this is what we did. So when you're talking about valuing a business, when you're talking about the price of a business, it's part science, but it's also part, I guess, gut feeling, if you like, intuition. Yes, there are accepted formulas, but you can argue those formulas, and people do. If you get 5 different accountants and 5 different business brokers in a room and ask them how do you value a business, they'll probably come up with a dozen different ways of valuing a business. Whoa, where's that wind come from? Well, I'm getting out of this wind. If you're getting value from this video, and I certainly hope you are, there's a button just for people like yourself. It looks like this. It's called the like button. It's just down there. If you're feeling generous, there's also the thanks button and, of course, the subscribe button. Hit any one of those 3 or all 3. That would make my day and be very much appreciated. Thanks very much in advance if you do that. Let's get back to the story. Well, I don't know where that wind came from, but it's a bit more sheltered in here, so we'll carry on here, shall we? Now, We put the value on the business. We appraised it using what they call a CMA, which is a current market appraisal. And what we did was we used market statistics, and we came up with a price based on what we thought equivalent businesses would sell in the market. Now, John did his own thing. He had a formula and he worked out his own formula and he came up with a value. And unfortunately, that value wasn't the same. So we had $1 million on the business, $995,000. Now John came up with a value. He thought it was worth $850,000. That's what he was prepared to pay. Now clearly that's $150,000 less than what we're asking for. Well, here comes this wind again. That's a bit better. So John put an offer in of $850,000. The seller, he didn't accept it, obviously. There was a bit of toing and froing, and finally the seller said to John, look, I'll reduce the price. I'll reduce the price to $925,000. Now you've come up a little bit. We're actually $50,000 apart. And that's where I'm stopping. I'm not reducing the price anymore. If you want to buy the business, you have to pay $925,000, which is 50 grand more than what you wanted to. Now, Jono wasn't too happy with that. Obviously, it was above where he thought the value of the business was. So he said, no, I'm out. I'm not paying that much. I will pay 875. That's the maximum I'll go to. So that 50 grand difference is too much. I'm out. I'll find something else. And he went his own way, and so did the seller of the business. Now that was fine. We sold the business, or I sold the business. It only took another 6 weeks. We sold the business, and incidentally, we got $950,000. So we actually got $25,000 more than the seller would have sold it to John had the negotiations continued. And that's fine. So fast forward 6 months, only 5 fingers. Fast forward 6 months later, and I spoke to John again. Now John actually called me and he goes, hey, how's it going? What's happening? I know I looked at that business 6 months ago, but I've actually decided that it is the right business for me and I am prepared to pay $925,000 for it. Is it still on the market? I don't see you advertising it anywhere. Now, I had to tell him, unfortunately, no, I had sold it, and we sold it for $950,000, more than what he was willing to pay at the time, but more also than what the seller was prepared to sell it for at the time. Now, Jono wasn't impressed. He said that was the best business he'd seen. It met all his requirements. He said he just couldn't see the value in it at the time. Oh, well, he goes, I'll carry on looking. So, okay, Jono carried on looking, and almost 6 months later, he found a business and bought a business. Incidentally, he bought it from me, so that's great. But he found a business that fitted all his criteria, and he bought the business. Now, what did he pay for it? Well, he'd learned his lesson. He ended up paying the bottom value he could negotiate down to, which was still more than what he was prepared to pay based on his formula, but he bought the business. Now, I ended up having lunch with John and we had a chat about it, and he regretted not buying the business he saw virtually a year earlier. And he said to me, it was a mistake and it cost me a lot of money. And this is how he put it. He said, I should have bought that business. Yes, it would have cost him a bit more than he was prepared to pay. It might have even cost him $75,000 more than he was prepared to pay. But the business was making $400,000 a year. So instead of paying that extra $75,000 at the time, he missed out on 11 months worth of profit. Now 11 months worth of profit, that was probably 400 odd grand in his pocket that he missed out on because he wasn't prepared to pay a little bit more at the beginning. And that was the lesson he learned. As he said, if he'd paid that little bit more, he would have recouped it easily enough from the profit it made and the lost opportunity cost. And that's what we're talking about here, lost opportunity. Because he didn't have a business for 11 months, he didn't earn anything. So that extra 75 grand would have given him, well, 400,000 in his pocket. That was the lesson he learned. But there's a little bit more to it than just that. So if you think about it logically, he could have paid the extra value that the seller wanted. He could have paid that $75,000 more than what he wanted to pay, and he could have recouped it pretty simply. What he could have done was had an early settlement, so he had profit quicker. So the business would have suddenly been making money quicker. So instead of taking 8 or 10 weeks to settle, he could have settled in 3 weeks. He was cashed up, he had the money, so he would have had that extra profit to offset the extra amount he wanted to pay. The other way of thinking, and I did suggest it to him at the time, was he could do the opposite. He could offer a longer settlement to the seller. So he could have sticked to his lower price, but said to the seller, hang on, we'll settle in 4 months' time. I'll give you 4 months more profit in the business, and you run the business, get 4 months extra profit, and then I take over. And that would have offset the lower price that he was prepared to pay. So those two options he could have done. They were open to him. We did suggest it, but he didn't do that. Again, another regret that he had. So another question Jono asked me is, what's the best business to buy? And I answered that by referring him to that video up there. If you want to know what the best business to buy is, have a look at that video up there. I'll see you over there. Thanks for watching. Cheerio.